The late afternoon sun beat down on the busy streets of downtown Atlanta, turning the asphalt into a shimmering heat trap. Traffic crawled at a snail's pace as cars jockeyed for position, everyone eager to get home after a long workday. Behind the wheel of a silver Honda Civic sat James Reynolds, a man who had every reason to feel good about his life. At 42 years old, he had finally reached a milestone he'd been working toward for decades. In just a few days, he would be officially sworn in as a federal judge. But today wasn't about work or prestige. Today was his day off. A rare moment to run errands in jeans and a comfortable polo shirt, looking like any other person trying to navigate rush hour. James checked his mirrors and signaled to merge into the right lane. The gap looked clear enough, so he eased his car over. What he didn't see was the sleek black Mercedes-Benz that had been accelerating in his blind spot. The Mercedes driver slammed on his brakes, and the angry blast of a horn shattered the relative quiet inside James's car. His heart jumped. He threw up an apologetic hand and mouthed "sorry" through his window, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The Mercedes stayed glued to his bumper, horn blaring intermittently. James could see the driver in his rearview mirror, a white man in a business suit, face flushed red with anger. When James pulled into a gas station to get out of the way and let the situation cool down, the Mercedes followed him in. This was going to be more than just road rage. James parked near the air pump and took a deep breath before stepping out. Maybe he could apologize properly, face to face, and they could both go on with their lives. That's what reasonable people did, right? The Mercedes screeched to a stop a few feet away, and the driver burst out like a storm that had been bottled up too long. He was tall, well-dressed in an expensive navy suit with a crimson tie slightly loosened at the neck. Everything about him screamed success and self-importance. "What the hell is wrong with you?" the man shouted, striding toward James with aggressive purpose. "You could have caused an accident. Do you even know how to drive?" James raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Hey, I'm really sorry about that. I checked my mirror, but I didn't see you. My mistake entirely." But his apology seemed to make things worse rather than better. The man stopped a few feet away, and something shifted in his expression as he took in James's appearance. His eyes traveled from James's face down to his casual clothes and back up again. The anger transformed into something uglier, something more deliberate. "Of course you didn't see me," the man said, his voice dripping with contempt. "People like you probably don't even have a valid license. What are you doing driving in this neighborhood anyway?" James felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly where this was going. He'd lived this moment before in different forms throughout his entire life. "Sir, again, I apologize for the merge," James said, keeping his voice steady. "It was an honest mistake." "An honest mistake?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me guess, you probably can't even afford the insurance on that piece of junk you're driving. If you'd hit my car, I'd be the one paying for it while you walked away." A small crowd was beginning to gather. Some people pumping gas had stopped to watch. A teenager near the convenience store entrance had pulled out his phone and appeared to be recording. The man didn't seem to notice or care about the audience. If anything, it emboldened him. "You people need to learn that there are consequences for your actions," he continued, his voice rising. "You can't just do whatever you want and expect everyone else to clean up your mess. This is exactly what's wrong with this city now. No respect, no responsibility, no—" "I think we should both just calm down," James interrupted gently. "I've apologized. I'm not looking for trouble." "Calm down?" The man's face grew even redder. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down." "Do you know who I am?" "I'm an attorney. A very successful attorney. I could make your life very difficult if I wanted to." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather business card holder, fumbling with it before extracting a card. He didn't hand it to James. Instead, he threw it, and it fluttered to the ground between them. "That's who I am. Richard Caldwell, Esquire. Caldwell and Associates. I handle cases worth more money than you'll see in your lifetime." He jabbed his finger toward James. "I could sue you for reckless driving. I could have your license suspended. You could go about your day," James said quietly. "Like I'm trying to go about mine." Something about James's calm demeanor seemed to infuriate Richard even more. His face contorted, and the words that came next were uglier, more explicitly hateful. He made assumptions about James's education, his background, his character, all based on nothing more than the color of his skin. He used the phrase "you people" 3 more times, each utterance cutting deeper than the last. James stood there and took it. He'd learned long ago that responding to this kind of hatred with matching anger only made things worse. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, but he kept them still. His jaw clenched, but his expression remained neutral. Inside, though, a familiar exhaustion settled over him. Not fear, but the bone-deep weariness that came from being seen as a threat as less than as other. A woman pumping gas called out, "Leave him alone!" He apologized. Richard spun toward her. "Mind your own business." He turned back to James, breathing hard, seeming to search for more words that could wound. When none came, he pointed at the business card still lying on the ground. "Pick it up," he demanded. "I want you to remember who you messed with today." James looked at the card, then back at Richard. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he bent down slowly, picked up the card and looked at it. Richard Caldwell, attorney at law. Caldwell and Associates. A downtown address. A phone number. An email. James slipped the card into his pocket. "I hope the rest of your day is better than this moment, sir," he said softly, without waiting for a response. James walked back to his car, got in, and started the engine. Through his windshield, he could see Richard still standing there, chest heaving, looking almost disappointed that James hadn't given him the confrontation he seemed to want. James pulled out of the gas station carefully, signaling properly, checking all his mirrors. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He drove 2 blocks before pulling over onto a quiet side street. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. His hands were shaking now, trembling against the steering wheel. He closed his eyes and counted to 10, then 20, then 30. This wasn't new. This was the price of being who he was in the world as it existed. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. It didn't make the humiliation any easier to swallow. James pulled out his phone and stared at it, thinking about calling his wife. But what would he say? That it had happened again? That another day had been poisoned by someone's hatred? She would be furious. She would want him to do something about it. He put the phone away and sat in the silence of his car, watching ordinary people walk by on the sidewalk, going about their ordinary lives, having no idea what had just transpired a few blocks away. After a few more minutes, James started the car again and drove home. Tomorrow was a new day. In less than a week, he would be sworn in as a federal judge, one of the highest honors in the legal profession. He would put on those robes and serve justice as he'd always dreamed of doing. But tonight, he was just a man who'd been reminded that no matter how high he climbed, some people would only ever see the color of his skin. What James didn't know was that tomorrow he would see Richard Caldwell again. And when he did, everything would change. James pulled into his driveway just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The house was a modest 2-story in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place he and his wife had dreamed about when they were young and struggling to make ends meet. Now it was theirs, paid for through years of hard work and sacrifice. His wife, Dr. Claire Reynolds, met him at the door. She was still in her scrubs from the hospital, her stethoscope hanging around her neck. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. "What happened?" she asked, pulling him inside. Over dinner, James told her the whole story. He tried to keep his voice neutral, sticking to the facts, but Claire knew him too well. She could hear the hurt underneath the calm exterior. "That's it," she said, putting down her fork with a sharp click. "You need to report him to the Bar Association. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, especially from an attorney." James shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Claire. What good would it do?" "What good?" Her voice rose slightly. "James, that man verbally assaulted you in public. He used his position as a lawyer to intimidate you. That's an ethics violation at minimum." "I've dealt with worse," James said quietly. "That doesn't make it okay." Claire stood up, too agitated to sit still. "You've worked your entire life to get where you are. You've faced discrimination at every level and pushed through it with grace and dignity. But this man needs to face consequences." James pulled Richard Caldwell's business card from his pocket and laid it on the table. They both stared at it for a moment. "Caldwell and Associates," Claire read aloud. She pulled out her phone and started typing. Within seconds, she was reading from the firm's website. One of the top corporate defense firms in the state. Major clients, high-profile cases. This guy has built his whole career on being respected in courtrooms. Which is exactly why reporting him might not do anything, James said. Men like that have connections, resources. The Bar Association might give him a slap on the wrist at best. Claire sat back down and took his hand. You're going to be a federal judge in less than a week. You represent everything the justice system should be. He represents everything that's wrong with it. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the decision hanging between them. James thought about his mother, who had cleaned other people's houses to pay for his college textbooks. He thought about his father, who had worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant and still found time to help him with homework. They had taught him that dignity wasn't something someone could take from you, but something you carried inside yourself no matter what the world threw at you. I'll think about it, he finally said. Later that night, James sat alone in his home office. The room was lined with law books and framed certificates marking the milestones of his career: his law degree from Howard University, his admission to the state bar, commendations from his years as a public defender. Each one represented a battle fought and won, a barrier broken through. On his desk sat the letter officially confirming his appointment as a United States District Court judge. He'd read it dozens of times, still hardly believing it was real. This was the culmination of everything he'd worked for, everything his parents had sacrificed for. James opened his laptop and searched for Richard Caldwell. The internet painted a picture of a successful man, law school at a prestigious university, partner at his firm by age 35. He'd won several major cases and had been quoted in news articles about corporate law. His firm's website showed him shaking hands with politicians and business leaders. James clicked through to a page about one of Richard's current cases. His stomach tightened as he read. Caldwell and Associates was defending a large tech company against a discrimination lawsuit. The plaintiffs claimed they'd been systematically denied promotions because of their race. Richard was the lead attorney for the defense. The irony was almost too much to bear. This man who had just spewed hatred at him in a parking lot was now arguing in court that his client hadn't discriminated against anyone. How could someone hold such contradictory positions? Or maybe it wasn't a contradiction at all. Maybe that was exactly the problem. James closed his laptop and looked at the framed photo on his desk. It showed him at age 10, standing between his parents in front of their small apartment building. His father had his hand on James's shoulder, and his mother was smiling despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. They had believed in him when he was just a kid with big dreams and no clear path to achieving them. What would they tell him to do now? Across town, Richard Caldwell was having a very different evening. He'd arrived home to his large house in an upscale suburb, still riding the adrenaline from the confrontation. His wife Patricia was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he walked in. "You won't believe what happened today," he said, loosening his tie and pouring himself a drink. "Some guy cut me off in traffic, nearly caused an accident. I had to set him straight." Patricia glanced at him but didn't respond, continuing to chop vegetables for a salad. "I mean, the audacity of some people," Richard continued, taking a long sip of his drink. "No consideration for anyone else on the road. I gave him a piece of my mind, let me tell you." "Did you get his insurance information?" Patricia asked, her tone neutral. "What?" "No, there wasn't an actual accident. I just wanted him to know he can't drive like that without consequences." Patricia set down her knife and turned to face him. "So you followed him and confronted him over a traffic incident where nothing actually happened?" "He could have hit my car," Richard said defensively. "Besides, someone needed to teach him a lesson." Before Patricia could respond, their 17-year-old daughter, Rachel, appeared in the doorway. She had her phone in her hand and a strange expression on her face. "Dad, what kind of car do you drive?" she asked. "You know what car I drive." "Why?" Rachel held up her phone. "Because I think you're on social media." Richard's blood ran cold. He crossed the room in 3 quick steps and looked at her screen. There it was, a video someone had recorded at the gas station. The quality wasn't great and the audio was muffled, but there was no mistaking who it was. Him, red-faced and pointing, standing over another man who stood calmly with his hands at his sides. The caption read, "Lawyer has meltdown over traffic incident." "Anyone know who this guy is?" "Delete that," Richard said sharply. "Right now." "Dad, I didn't post it. It's already out there. It has like 5,000 views." Richard grabbed his own phone and found the post. His hands shook slightly as he scrolled through the comments. Most people were criticizing the man in the video, calling him entitled and aggressive. A few were trying to identify him. So far, no one had succeeded. "What exactly did you say to that man?" Patricia asked, her voice careful. "Nothing. Just I was angry about the driving. I might have raised my voice. Rachel was still watching him, and there was something in her eyes he didn't like. Disappointment, maybe. Or was it recognition of something she'd always suspected but never wanted to confirm? "I'm going to my room," she said quietly and left without another word. Patricia returned to making dinner without speaking. The silence in the kitchen felt heavy and accusatory. Richard went to his home office and closed the door. He pulled up his calendar for the next day. Tomorrow was the preliminary hearing for the Tech Corp discrimination case, one of the biggest cases his firm was handling this year. He needed to focus, to prepare, to be at his best. He opened his case files and tried to review his notes, but his mind kept drifting back to the video. Would anyone figure out who he was? Would it affect his reputation? His career, the firm? No, he decided. The video was too grainy, too vague. In a few days it would be buried under millions of other posts and forgotten. These things always blew over. Richard had no idea that tomorrow morning he would walk into a federal courtroom expecting just another day of legal arguments. He had no idea that the man he'd humiliated would be sitting in the one position where power truly mattered. He had no idea that his entire world was about to change in the most unexpected way possible. As Richard reviewed his case files late into the night, confident in his arguments and his position, James Reynolds lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Claire was asleep beside him, but sleep wouldn't come for James. He kept replaying the encounter in his mind, hearing Richard's words, feeling the weight of that familiar exhaustion. Tomorrow he would officially begin his duties as a federal judge. Tomorrow he would put on those robes for the first time and take his place on the bench. Tomorrow the real work would begin. He had no idea that Richard Caldwell would be standing in his courtroom in less than 12 hours. Sometimes fate has a sense of timing that borders on the poetic. Tomorrow, both men would learn that lesson in the most dramatic way possible. Thursday morning arrived with cloudless skies and the promise of a hot day ahead. James Reynolds woke at 5:30, earlier than his alarm. He'd barely slept, his mind too active with thoughts about what the day would bring. His first official day as a federal judge. Not the ceremony or the celebration, but the actual work, the cases, the decisions, the responsibility of holding justice in his hands. He showered and dressed carefully, taking his time with each button on his crisp white shirt. The black judicial robe hung on the back of his closet door, still pristine and unworn. He'd tried it on once when it arrived, standing in front of the mirror and feeling the weight of what it represented. Today it would mean something real. Claire made him breakfast, though he could barely eat. She kissed him at the door and reminded him that he'd earned this, that he belonged there, that he would be brilliant. He held her a moment longer than usual before heading to his car. The federal courthouse was the imposing building downtown, all stone columns and marble steps. James had been here countless times as an attorney, but walking through those doors today felt completely different. Security guards who used to nod at him professionally now stood a bit straighter, addressed him as Your Honor, even though he told them that wasn't necessary yet. His chambers were on the 4th floor, a suite of rooms that still smelled like fresh paint and new carpet. His clerk, a sharp young woman named Helen who'd graduated top of her class from Emory, had already organized his files for the day. 3 cases on the docket, she said, handing him a folder. The first 2 should be straightforward. The third one is the Tech Corp discrimination case. That's the big one. James flipped through the materials. Morrison versus Tech Corp Industries. The plaintiffs were 6 black employees who claimed they'd been systematically passed over for promotions, despite exemplary performance reviews. The defense was being handled by Caldwell and Associates. His stomach tightened at the firm's name, but he pushed the feeling aside. He had a job to do, and personal feelings had no place in his courtroom. Across town, Richard Caldwell was also preparing for his day. He'd slept poorly, the video from the gas station nagging at the back of his mind, but morning light had restored some of his confidence. He was a professional. He'd been practicing law for over 20 years. One bad moment caught on a grainy video wouldn't define him. He put on his best suit, a charcoal gray that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. His briefcase was packed with carefully organized files and exhibits. His opening arguments were memorized. This case was important to the firm, and he intended to win it. His associate attorneys met him in the parking garage of the courthouse. They rode the elevator together, discussing last-minute strategy. Richard felt like himself again, in control, powerful. This was his territory. Who's the judge on this case? One of the associates asked. Someone new, Richard replied. A recent appointment. Thompson, I think, or Reynolds. One of those. They walked through the courthouse hallways with the easy confidence of people who belonged there. Richard greeted other attorneys he knew, exchanged pleasantries with court staff. Outside the courtroom, he spotted the opposing counsel, an experienced civil rights attorney named Brenda Morrison. She was black, in her 50s, with a reputation for being tough but fair. Richard, she acknowledged him with a curt nod. Brenda, ready to have your case dismissed? He meant it as professional banter, but it came out more arrogant than intended. We'll see who walks out of here happy, she replied coolly. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors, and everyone filed in. Richard took his place at the defense table, arranging his materials with practiced precision. His associates flanked him, legal pads ready. Across the aisle, Brenda Morrison and her team prepared their materials. The courtroom slowly filled with spectators. Some TechCorp executives sat in the gallery, along with what appeared to be family members of the plaintiffs. The air felt charged with anticipation. Richard glanced at his watch. 9 o'clock exactly. Right on time, the door to the judge's chambers opened. All rise, the bailiff's voice rang out. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia is now in session. The Honorable Judge James Reynolds presiding. Richard stood automatically, his eyes still on his notes. But something made him look up. Maybe it was the way one of his associates gasped slightly beside him. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fate. Walking through the door in full judicial robes was the man from the gas station. The man he'd berated. The man he'd insulted and threatened. The man whose business card he'd thrown on the ground. The color drained from Richard's face so fast he felt dizzy. His mouth went dry. His heart began hammering in his chest so hard he thought everyone in the courtroom must be able to hear it. No, this couldn't be happening. This was impossible. But there he was, Judge James Reynolds, taking his seat at the bench with calm dignity. He arranged his materials, adjusted his glasses, and looked out over the courtroom with an expression of complete professional neutrality. Please be seated, James said, his voice steady and clear. Everyone sat except Richard, who remained frozen, standing at the defense table like a statue. His associate touched his arm. Mr. Caldwell? You okay? Richard sat down heavily, his legs suddenly unreliable. His mind was racing through every word he'd said yesterday, every insult, every threat. He'd told that man he could ruin his life. He'd made assumptions about his intelligence, his background, his character. And now that man was sitting in judgment over his case. This was a nightmare. This had to be a nightmare. Let's begin, James said from the bench. We have case number 2025-CV-3847, Morrison versus TechCorp Industries. Counsel, please state your appearances for the record. Brenda Morrison stood smoothly. Brenda Morrison of Morrison and Associates, appearing on behalf of the plaintiffs, Your Honor. All eyes turned to Richard. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like rubber. On his second attempt, he made it to his feet. Richard Caldwell of Caldwell and Associates, he managed to say, his voice coming out hoarse and unfamiliar. Appearing for the defense. James looked at him for just a fraction of a second, nothing more than a judge acknowledging an attorney's appearance. But in that brief moment, Richard saw something in those eyes. Recognition, yes, but also something else. Composure, professionalism, the kind of dignity that couldn't be shaken by hatred or insults. Thank you, counsel, James said, his tone unchanged. This is a preliminary hearing on the defense's motion to dismiss. Mr. Caldwell, you may begin with your arguments. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His carefully memorized opening had completely evaporated from his mind. His hands shuffled through papers without seeing them. Beside him, his associates exchanged worried glances. Mr. Caldwell? James prompted. Are you ready to proceed? Yes, Your Honor, Richard forced out. I apologize. Just organizing my notes. He began his argument, but it was a disaster from the first sentence. Points he'd made 100 times before now stumbled from his mouth in fragments. He lost his train of thought mid-sentence. He cited the wrong case precedent and had to be corrected by his own associate in an embarrassing whisper. Through it all, Judge Reynolds remained perfectly professional. He asked clarifying questions when Richard's arguments became unclear. He gave him opportunities to recover and restate his points. He showed no favoritism, no bias, no indication of their previous encounter, which somehow made it worse. Richard had expected anger or coldness or some sign that the judge remembered what had happened, but James simply did his job with quiet competence, treating both sides with equal respect and attention. When it was Brenda Morrison's turn to argue, she was sharp and well prepared. She laid out how the plaintiffs had been consistently overlooked for promotions despite strong performance. She presented statistical evidence of a pattern of discrimination. She cited relevant cases and legal standards with precision. Richard tried to focus, tried to find holes in her argument, but his mind kept circling back to the same thought. This man could destroy me right now if he wanted to. One mention of yesterday's incident, one ethics complaint to the Bar Association, and my career is over. The hearing stretched on for nearly 2 hours. Richard's performance went from bad to worse. At one point, Judge Reynolds had to ask him to repeat an argument because it had been so garbled the court reporter couldn't transcribe it properly. Finally, James leaned back in his chair and looked at both attorneys. "I've heard sufficient arguments from both sides. The court will take a brief recess to review the materials, and I'll issue my ruling when we reconvene in 20 minutes. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Reynolds left the bench. The moment he disappeared through the door to his chambers, Richard's associates turned on him. "What is going on with you?" the senior associate demanded in a harsh whisper. "That was the worst I've ever seen you argue." Richard couldn't answer. He walked out of the courtroom on unsteady legs, found the men's room, and locked himself in a stall. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. This was it. This was karma, or fate, or divine justice, or whatever you wanted to call it. He'd spent yesterday evening thinking the video didn't matter, that he'd face no consequences. And now here he was, standing before the very man he'd wronged, completely at his mercy. 20 minutes felt like 20 seconds. When the bailiff called them back into the courtroom, Richard took his seat feeling like a condemned man walking to the gallows. Judge Reynolds returned to the bench, his expression unreadable. He had a single sheet of paper in front of him with handwritten notes. "I've reviewed the arguments and the case materials," James began. "The defense has moved to dismiss this case on several grounds. After careful consideration, I find that the plaintiffs have sufficiently stated a claim under Title VII. The statistical evidence presented, combined with the individual testimonies, meets the threshold for proceeding to discovery." Richard felt his stomach drop. "Therefore, the defense's motion to dismiss is denied. This case will proceed to discovery. I'm setting a schedule for depositions to begin in 3 weeks with document production to be completed within 60 days. It was over. They'd lost the motion. The case would continue, but James wasn't finished. He looked out over the courtroom, his gaze sweeping across everyone present. "I want to say something to all counsel here today," he said, his voice carrying weight and authority. "This court expects the highest standards of professional conduct, not just in this courtroom, but everywhere. The legal profession is built on integrity, respect, and equal justice under law. Those principles don't stop at the courthouse doors. They should guide everything we do, every interaction we have, every choice we make." The words landed on Richard like physical blows, even though they were addressed to everyone. "We're adjourned," James concluded, and struck his gavel once. As people began gathering their things and filing out, the bailiff approached Richard. "Mr. Caldwell, Judge Reynolds would like to see you in chambers." Richard's heart stopped. This was it. The moment of reckoning he'd been dreading. He walked toward the judge's chambers like a man walking through deep water, every step an effort. Whatever came next, he deserved it. He knew that much. The question was, what kind of man was Judge James Reynolds? Vindictive or merciful? And which would hurt more? The walk to Judge Reynolds's chambers felt endless. Richard's feet moved automatically, but his mind was spinning with possibilities, each worse than the last. Would the judge file a complaint with the state bar? Would he recuse himself from the case and make the reason public? Would he demand an apology in front of witnesses? The bailiff opened the door to the judge's chambers and gestured for Richard to enter. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Judge Reynolds stood by the window, still in his robes, looking out at the city below. He didn't turn around immediately. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. "Your Honor, Richard began, his voice cracking. James held up one hand, still not turning around. "Let me speak first, Mr. Caldwell." Richard's mouth snapped shut. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Finally, James turned to face him. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Richard want to look away. Not anger exactly, something deeper and more painful to witness. "Do you know why I asked you here?" James said quietly. "Because of yesterday," Richard managed to say. "Because of what I said to you." "And what did you say to me, Mr. Caldwell?" "Be specific." Richard felt heat rise to his face. Having to repeat his own words, to acknowledge them out loud in this moment, was its own form of punishment. "I said things that were disrespectful, prejudiced. I made assumptions about you based on your race. I threatened you with my position as an attorney." James walked slowly to his desk and sat down, gesturing for Richard to take one of the chairs across from him. Richard sat, feeling like a child called to the principal's office. "I want you to understand something," James said, his voice measured and careful. "My ruling today had absolutely nothing to do with our encounter yesterday. The plaintiffs presented a solid case with sufficient evidence to proceed. Your motion to dismiss was weak on its merits. That's why I denied it, not because of any personal feelings. I understand, Your Honor. Do you?" James leaned forward slightly. "Because I need you to really understand this. I took an oath when I accepted this position, an oath to administer justice fairly and impartially. That oath means something to me. It means everything to me. I will not compromise it, not for revenge, not for personal satisfaction, not for anything." Richard nodded, not trusting his voice. "Having said that," James continued, "we need to address what happened yesterday. Because what you did was not just offensive to me personally. It was a violation of the ethical standards every attorney is supposed to uphold." Here it comes, Richard thought. The complaint. The investigation. The end of everything. "I could file a complaint with the State Bar Association," James said, as if reading his thoughts. "Your behavior yesterday was witnessed by multiple people. There's video evidence. You used your position as an attorney to intimidate someone. That's serious." "I know," Richard whispered, "but I'm not going to do that." Richard's head snapped up, confusion and disbelief written across his face. "You're not?" James shook his head slowly. "No. And not because what you did wasn't serious enough to warrant it. It absolutely was. But because I believe, perhaps naively, that people are capable of change. I believe that sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from punishment, but from the opportunity to choose to be better." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm giving you that opportunity, Mr. Caldwell. I'm giving you the chance to look at yourself honestly, to examine your beliefs and behaviors, and to decide what kind of lawyer and what kind of man you want to be." Richard felt something break inside him. He'd been prepared for anger, for consequences, for justified retribution. But this grace he absolutely did not deserve. It was harder to bear than any punishment would have been. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Don't say anything right now," James replied. "Go home, think about it. Really think about it. Think about the case you're defending right now. About 6 people who claim they were judged not by their abilities, but by their skin color. Think about how you judged me yesterday. Think about whether those two things might be connected." Richard nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "And Mr. Caldwell, don't waste this. Don't waste the opportunity I'm giving you. Because if I ever hear that you've treated anyone else the way you treated me, I will make sure the Bar Association knows everything." "Am I clear?" "Yes, Your Honor, perfectly clear. You can go." Richard stood on shaky legs and walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when James spoke again. "For what it's worth, you're not the first person to see me as less than human because of my skin color, and you won't be the last. But that doesn't mean I have to accept it, and it doesn't mean you have to keep being that person." Richard left the chambers without another word. He walked through the courthouse in a daze, barely seeing where he was going. His associates tried to talk to him about the case, about their next steps, but he waved them off and told them he needed to be alone. He drove home in the middle of the day, something he never did. The house was empty. Patricia was at work, Rachel at school. He sat in his home office, the same place where he'd confidently prepared for court just hours earlier, and stared at nothing. Everything he thought he knew about himself had been shaken. He'd always considered himself a good person, a successful professional, someone who followed the rules and worked hard. But Judge Reynolds had held up a mirror, and Richard didn't like what he saw reflected back. He opened his laptop and pulled up the TechCorp case files. For the first time, he actually read through the depositions of the plaintiffs. Really read them, not just scanning for weaknesses to exploit. There was David Chen, who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times despite consistently excellent reviews. Each time the position went to a white candidate with less experience. There was Angela Martinez, who'd been told she wasn't management material, even though she'd increased her department's productivity by 40%. There was Kevin Brown, who'd been written up for being too aggressive when making the same suggestions his white colleagues made regularly and were praised for. Their stories echoed each other. Different details, same pattern. Being judged not by what they did, but by who they were. Just like he'd judged Judge Reynolds yesterday. Richard closed his laptop and put his head in his hands. How many times had he done this? How many people had he dismissed, underestimated, or prejudged based on nothing but their appearance? How many times had he been part of the problem while telling himself he was just doing his job? That evening, when Rachel came home from school, she found her father sitting in the dark living room. "Dad, are you okay?" Richard looked at his daughter, this person he'd brought into the world and tried to teach right from wrong. What had he actually taught her? What had she learned from watching him? "Rachel, about that video you showed me yesterday. The one from the gas station." She sat down slowly on the couch across from him. "What about it?" "That man I was yelling at. I found out today who he is." "Who?" "He's a federal judge. He was just appointed. And today he was the judge on one of my cases." Rachel's eyes widened. "Oh my God." "Yeah." Richard let out a long breath. "I walked into that courtroom this morning expecting a normal day. Instead, I came face to face with my own worst behavior." "What did he do? Did he throw you off the case?" "No, that's the thing. He was completely professional. Fair. He ruled based on the law, not on personal feelings. And then he called me into his chambers and told me he wasn't going to report me to the Bar Association, even though he had every right to." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" "Because he believes people can change. He gave me a chance to be better. Are you going to be?" It was such a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of everything. Richard looked at his daughter and saw hope mixed with doubt in her expression. She wanted to believe in him, but she wasn't sure she could anymore. "I'm going to try," he said. "I'm really going to try." Over the next several days, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Judge Reynolds' words. He went through the motions at work, but his heart wasn't in it. During a strategy meeting about the TechCorp case, his senior partner laid out their approach. Attack the plaintiff's credibility. Argue that the promotion decisions were based on legitimate business reasons. Settle for as little money as possible if they had to. "Actually," Richard heard himself say, "I think we need to look at this case differently." The conference room went quiet. Everyone turned to stare at him. "What do you mean?" his partner asked. "I mean, what if the plaintiffs are right? What if TechCorp really did discriminate against them? Shouldn't we be advising our client to fix the problem instead of just defending their actions?" His partner's expression hardened. "Our job is to represent our client's interests, Richard, not to second-guess their business decisions. But what if representing their interests means telling them the truth? That they're going to lose this case because they actually did what they're accused of doing?" The meeting ended badly. His partners looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Or maybe for the first time in a long time he was actually seeing clearly. That night, Richard sat down at his computer and began writing. Not a legal brief or a strategy memo, but something personal. A letter he might never send, but needed to write anyway. "Dear Judge Reynolds," it began. "I know an apology can't undo what I said and did. But I need you to know that your decision to show me grace instead of giving me what I deserved has changed something in me. You held up a mirror and I finally saw myself clearly. I don't like what I saw, but I'm grateful for the chance to become someone different. Someone better." He saved the letter but didn't send it, not yet. First, he needed to figure out what someone better actually looked like. And that was going to take more than just words on a page. It was going to take action. Real, difficult, costly action. The question was, did he have the courage to follow through? 3 weeks passed, and Richard Caldwell barely recognized his own life anymore. The change had started small, almost invisible. But it was growing into something he couldn't ignore or turn back from. It began with the TechCorp case. Richard spent hours reviewing every piece of evidence, every deposition, every email exchange. The more he read, the clearer the truth became. TechCorp had absolutely discriminated against their employees. The pattern was undeniable once he stopped looking for ways to excuse it and started looking for the truth. He requested a meeting with TechCorp's CEO and legal team. They gathered in a sleek conference room on the 20th floor of their downtown headquarters, expecting Richard to present his winning strategy. Instead, he told them they were going to lose. "The evidence is overwhelming," Richard said, laying out documents on the table. "Every plaintiff has a documented history of excellent performance reviews, followed by being passed over for promotions. The people who got those promotions? Less qualified, less experienced, but they all share one thing in common." The CEO shifted uncomfortably. "We made legitimate business decisions based on bias," Richard interrupted. "Maybe conscious, maybe unconscious, but bias nonetheless. And if we go to trial, a jury is going to see that. More importantly, they should see that because that's what happened." The room erupted in protests. This wasn't what they were paying his firm for. They wanted a defense, not a lecture. Richard let them finish, then spoke quietly. "I'm recommending we settle. Not for the minimum we can get away with, but for what's fair. Real compensation for the harm done, policy changes to prevent this from happening again, and a public acknowledgement of where TechCorp went wrong." "Absolutely not," the CEO said firmly. "That would destroy our reputation." "Your reputation is already destroyed if this goes to trial," Richard countered. "This way you control the narrative. You become the company that recognized a problem and fixed it, instead of the company that fought tooth and nail to avoid accountability." The meeting ended with TechCorp threatening to fire his firm. Richard expected that. What he didn't expect was how little it bothered him. He'd spent 20 years building his career on winning at any cost. Now he was realizing that some costs were too high. When he returned to his office, his senior partner was waiting for him. "We need to talk about your handling of the TechCorp case," the partner said, closing the door behind him. "I know," Richard said. "I told them the truth. I know that's not what we usually do." "Richard, what's going on with you? Ever since that preliminary hearing, you've been different. Distracted. Now you're basically sabotaging one of our biggest clients." Richard sat down heavily in his chair. "I'm not sabotaging them. I'm trying to help them do the right thing." "The right thing?" His partner's voice rose. "Our job isn't to determine what's right or wrong. Our job is to represent our clients to the best of our ability. And I am. But representing them to the best of my ability means telling them when they're wrong, not helping them hide it." The conversation went in circles for an hour. In the end, his partner delivered an ultimatum. Drop this new moral crusade or start looking for a new firm. That night, Richard talked it through with Patricia. She'd been watching his transformation with a mixture of concern and cautious optimism. The man who'd come home 3 weeks ago bragging about putting someone in their place was gone. In his place was someone struggling to figure out who he wanted to be. "If you leave the firm, we'll be okay financially," Patricia said. "We have savings. But Richard, you need to be sure about this. You've worked your entire adult life to become a partner there." "I know. But what's the point of all that work if I became someone I don't respect in the process?" Rachel, who'd been listening from the hallway, appeared in the doorway. "I think you should do it, Dad. I think you should leave." Richard looked at his daughter in surprise. "Really?" "Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about that video, about who you were in that moment. And I've been watching who you're becoming now. I like this version of you better, even if it means you have to start over." Her words meant more to him than she could possibly know. The next morning, Richard drafted 2 letters. The first was to his partners, formally resigning from the firm. The second was to Brenda Morrison, the attorney representing the TechCorp plaintiffs. In it, he detailed internal communications he'd discovered that proved TechCorp's leadership knew about the discriminatory practices and had actively worked to conceal them. He was violating attorney-client privilege, which could cost him his law license. But staying silent would cost him something more important, his integrity. He also sent the letter he'd written to Judge Reynolds weeks earlier, finally finding the courage to be that vulnerable. When TechCorp found out what Richard had done, they threatened legal action. But faced with the evidence he'd provided to the plaintiffs, they quickly realized fighting would only make things worse. Within 2 weeks, they agreed to a settlement that included significant compensation, mandatory bias training for all leadership, and an independent audit of their promotion practices. The 6 plaintiffs got their justice. And Richard? He got something too, though it came at a price. The State Bar Association launched an investigation into his violation of attorney-client privilege. Richard cooperated fully, explaining his reasoning without making excuses. He'd broken the rules, and he accepted responsibility for that. While he waited for their decision, Richard took a job at a small nonprofit legal clinic that helped low-income workers fight employment discrimination. The pay was a fraction of what he'd made at his old firm. The office was cramped and the cases were difficult. But for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was doing something that mattered. One afternoon, about 3 months after that fateful day in court, Richard was working at the clinic when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello? Mr. Caldwell, this is Judge Reynolds." Richard's heart jumped. "Your Honor, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I received your letter. I wanted to respond personally rather than in writing." Richard held his breath. "What you did took courage," James said. "Walking away from everything you built, putting your career on the line to do the right thing, that's not easy. Most people never find that kind of strength." "I'm not sure the Bar Association is going to see it that way," Richard said quietly. "I might lose my license. You might. But you won't lose yourself. That's worth something." They talked for 20 minutes. James shared some of his own story, the barriers he'd faced, the times he'd had to choose between what was easy and what was right. By the end of the conversation, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. "Can I ask you something, Your Honor?" Richard said before they hung up. "Of course. That day in your chambers, why did you really give me a second chance? You could have destroyed my career right then. Part of me thinks I deserved it." James was quiet for a moment. "Because I've seen what hatred and revenge do to people. They eat you from the inside out. I didn't want to become someone who used power to punish, even when the punishment was deserved. I wanted to be someone who used power to give people the chance to be better. Thank you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "for seeing something in me worth saving." "I didn't save you, Richard. You saved yourself. I just held up a mirror." After they hung up, Richard sat at his desk in the tiny nonprofit office and looked around. The walls needed paint. The chairs were mismatched. The computer was old and slow. But the work was real and it mattered, and he was helping people who truly needed it. 6 months later, the Bar Association issued their ruling. Richard received a formal reprimand and a year of probation, but he kept his license. The decision noted that while his violation of privilege was serious, his cooperation with the investigation and his genuine remorse warranted leniency. Richard framed that reprimand and hung it in his office, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder that he'd chosen integrity over success, truth over victory, and himself over the person he used to be. He kept working at the clinic, taking on cases nobody else wanted. He won some and lost others, but every single one mattered. He started teaching a class at the local law school about ethics in practice, sharing his own failures as cautionary tales. Patricia and Richard's marriage survived the transformation, though it took work. She had to learn to love this new version of her husband, the one who came home tired but satisfied instead of wealthy but empty. Eventually, she realized she preferred him this way. Rachel went to law school herself a few years later. On her graduation day, she told her father that his decision to change had inspired her to pursue justice rather than just a paycheck.